Welcome to what is our third industrial strategies dialogue that we organized together with our friends from DIW, and this is where we are today. And today we're going to have a deeper look at AI. Everybody's thinking about it. It's transforming the way we are looking for information, for sure. It's in the process of transforming economic and many other fields of research. And many people expect it to transform business totally, perhaps putting people out of work, perhaps leading to a productivity explosion and solving issues like aging. But for that to happen, of course, in the first instance, AI has to be actually adopted by firms. And we're going to discuss that today, and we're going to discuss about whether policies to promote that need to be part of a well-thought-of industrial strategy. And we're starting with our stellar OECD industrial policies team. Flavio Calvino is here to tell us a little bit about where OECD research stands in terms of adoption, its enablers, and possible impacts. Flavio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much. It's great being here. And indeed, I'm gonna talk a little bit about AI adoption, its diffusion, and what can policy do. So what I'm gonna do in this talk, I'm gonna touch upon basically three different bits. So we're going to talk about diffusion, AI diffusion among sectors and among firms. What are the key enablers for diffusion? Then I'm going to talk about the returns, especially focusing on the links between AI use and productivity and the extent to which the use of AI already translates into productivity returns. And then I'm going to try and look about the policy considerations and discuss what this means for public policy. This is based on different papers, quite a bit of different publications, and this is collaborative work with many co-authors that contributed to this research, and you'll see the references at the bottom of each slide. So let me start a little bit talking about diffusion. What we have been doing in the past few years at the OECD, we have been trying and looking at different sources of microdata to try and track the diffusion of artificial intelligence among firms. And one of these data sources that we have been leveraging extensively over the past few years is related to survey information. And so what we have been doing is we have pioneered what we call the distributed microdata approach, where we write some statistical code that we then send to experts that sit and are in different institutions like statistical offices that have access to these confidential microdata that contain very detailed information about the use of technology, notably AI, firm characteristics that allow tracking productivity, as well as the information about other factors that are related to firm behavior, notably including the use of other digital technologies, the digital maturity of firms, the skill of the workforce. And so we have been doing so in the past couple of years, in the past few years, more than two actually, in the context of the AI Diffuse and the Digital Diffuse project, which, as I kind of already explained, provide a harmonized way to look at the diffusion of advanced digital technologies across countries. And in doing so, we have been releasing a couple of papers. One is more focused on AI, and the other broadens the scope to the use of other digital technologies, but more closely focusing on AI. What we see in the analysis is that, as you can expect, AI tends to be more widely used across large firms. And you see this in the figure, which kind of says that where you see the circle that is larger suggests that in all the countries for which we were able to analyze data, the highest share of AI users is among firms which has 250 more employees. So this is a basic descriptive findings, which is, however, confirmed when we go deeper into the data and we do some regression analysis that controls for instance, the sectoral composition of economies, as well as other characteristics such as factors specific to the years or whenever possible geographical heterogeneity. What remains is that even controlling upon these factors, and notably the sectoral composition of economies, larger firms tend to be higher users of artificial intelligence across the board, basically. When let us focus a little bit on the sectoral heterogeneity dimension. What we did here is a paper where we kind of look at different dimensions of the extent to which the sectors of the economy are AI intensive. And we look at that by kind of distinguishing 4 different margins, one of which is AI talent, the demand for AI-related jobs. The second is the extent to which AI developments is produced, so AI innovation, and we use patent data for that. Then we have a dimension that is related to the potential of AI in different sectors, and for this we use a modified version of an exposure measure that is widely used in the literature, taking into account relevant barriers to such exposure. And then we look at the use of artificial intelligence, so based on the survey data I was just talking about. And what turns out, so this is just a summary slide in the paper, we have a lot more details among the different dimensions, is that, as you see on the horizontal red square, sectors with high AI intensity, so those like media, telecom and ICT services, are also those shaping the technology in terms of innovation, as well as those exhibiting highest demand of human capital related to artificial intelligence. But one of the things that I think it's important to remember, and we'll see this also going on in the rest of the presentation, is there is not such a thing as a typical AI adopter. Like in this paper, we managed with different sources of microdata for the UK to distinguish 3 different margins, going at the micro level, so the innovators, those that have AI-related innovations, those firms that have AI at the core of the business, so those that have actually those that are actually in their firm website reference to AI-related terminology. And then the AI talent, so those firms that are actually hiring AI specialized workforce, or they are demanding for AI-related job postings. And what we see, for instance, in this figure that just focuses on the sectoral heterogeneity, is that while AI innovators and firms that have AI at the core of the business are more concentrated in the ICT sectors, companies that are hiring AI-related talent, so that are posting online job postings related to artificial intelligence, tend to be actually more widespread across sectors. So this was a little bit talking about some dimensions of diffusion. Let me talk a little bit about what are relevant enablers for the diffusion of artificial intelligence, at least those that we were able to track in the analysis that we have been doing and for which we have information in the microdata. So one of the things that we do see, and this is a result of analysis based on the COVID period, on the digital investments during the COVID pandemic in the European countries, is that the digital transformation is a cumulative process that is unlikely to happen abruptly, but rather builds upon pre-existing expertise, pre-existing infrastructure, and the pre-existing knowledge base. And what you see in the slide, that is basically a directed network of technological adoption, where you have basically at the bottom, this is entirely data-driven, and you have at the bottom those technologies that tend to be at the backbone of the digital transformation, like broadband, IT infrastructure, and you see that when you go up, the different technologies that tend to be more advanced, coming until up to machine learning, tend to build upon the more enabling and foundational ones. And we see that there are significant interdependencies also when we look at the ICT survey microdata, where again, carrying out an analysis of co-occurrences, so of the simultaneous occurrences among firms of the use of different digital technologies, we see again that more advanced technologies tend to build on the more foundational ones and on the digital infrastructure. You see that in the figure where the color gradients represent a higher centrality in the network of technological co-occurrences. And this suggests that there are strong organizational and technological interdependencies in the diffusion of advanced digital technologies, including artificial intelligence. where enablers could reduce adoption costs and help realize the returns to this technology. One of the things that we have been doing recently, and we are continuing looking forward to look into that, is looking at the heterogeneity in the different types of AI use and in the different ways in which firms use artificial intelligence. And I think this is probably an important point, because the discussion is often about whether about using AI or not using AI, but there are important elements of qualifications that relate, for instance, to which technology a firm is using, how it is using it, in which parts of the firm, in which business function. And so what we have been starting doing here is looking at the different AI technologies and the extent to which they relate to each other, and they link into they link within the production and services delivery at the firm. And when we do that in France, we see that AI technologies exhibit significant interdependencies among each other, both with enabling technologies that you don't see here on the slide, but also among them. You see here the conditional probabilities of AI use for each of the technologies and for each purpose for which firms is using it in different business functions. And what turns out in this figure is that we see that some AI technologies that are those in the square, basically where you see higher conditional probabilities, they tend to support most business functions, from commercial activity to production processes to digital security to R&D. And these are typically text mining, machine learning, automation, and data-driven decision-making, while you have other technologies like autonomous movement, which appear to be more specific, in particular within the logistic departments of the firm, which suggests that there are some types of AI use or type of technologies that tend to be more general purpose than others, at least when we look at use patterns. Then, continuing the discussion of enablers in the microdata analysis, we see across the board that human and technological capital are critical in the age of artificial intelligence. And we have looked into that in the microdata, looking at different factors that allow us to proxy for the presence of digital infrastructure, for digital and innovative capabilities of firms, so their technological maturity, their digital maturity, their human capital, so the skills of the workforce, the occupational composition, and to some extent, their internationalization. And when we do that, here I present some figures from a recent paper that focuses on technological intensity and the human capital-related dimensions, so ICT, the presence of ICT specialists, ICT training, and broadband availability. You see that, in particular, the skills and the technological capital are throughout across the board, especially the technological intensity variable, whenever we have information about that, so the gray squares is where we don't have that information, are consistently and positively correlated with the use of artificial intelligence by firms, even after conditioning for basic firm characteristics and controlling for relevant confounding factors such as age, size, or sector of activity. So this suggests the importance, on the one hand, of the technological side, so the interdependencies, the digital maturities, and on the other hand, the human capital side. And when focusing on human capital, we have a paper that zooms in on France and analyzes comprehensive microdata sources for firms and workers. We suggest that ICT and technical skills are definitely an important dimension for and an important driver of use of pre-generative AI technologies, which are what we can focus a little bit more closely on in most of the analysis that focus on periods that predate the diffusion and the boom, the more recent boom in generative AI. So we see a critical role of ICT engineers, not only in ICT services and also when controlling for endogeneity in a number of ways, but also, and not only, ICT and technical skills are important, but relevantly, socio-emotional and foundational skills appear critical in the age of AI And here in the figure, we look at that focusing on leading AI employers, for which we look at the demand for their AI-related skills, and we see as well as for other skills, and we see that together with the technical skills, these employers, which are those firms, those employers that in the United States post the bulk of the AI-related job postings for which we can look at, they also combine these technical skills with demand for innovation, problem solving, and leadership. We suggest that beyond the technical skills, foundational skills, reasoning, innovation, problem solving, and more broadly, critical thinking are relevant in the age of artificial intelligence. Then let me spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about the returns, so the links between the use of artificial intelligence and productivity. And what emerges in our analysis across countries, here is a paper where we look at 10 countries, we have done it more recently focusing on 15 countries with more recent data, is that AI users tend to be more productive than other firms. So we see that in the data, the use of artificial intelligence are more productive. But these advantages of users do not seem to be necessarily related to the use of artificial intelligence alone. However, they actually appear to be more related to the fact that these firms are already more digital, they have already a higher, are more skilled human capital, because when we take into account these factors, these human and technological capital that in this slide we call complementary assets, the productivity advantages of AI users tend to go down significantly, and even in most cases they disappear. We suggest that at least on average, and at least for the period for which we have data, which again is prior to the more recent boom in generative AI, the productivity advantages of AI users tend to be, at least to some extent, related to the selection of more digital and more competitive and more productive firms into the use of artificial intelligence. We see this also when we broaden the focus to other advanced technologies. I won't go too much into this as I don't have a lot of time, but this is just to show if you focus on the first column, that again, even when we repeated more recently this type of analysis with more recent data and for more country, the patterns that we see is very much similar to what I've just discussed, and is something that also holds for other digital technologies such as the Internet of Things, for which firms that use tend to be considerably more productive, but once you account for these factors, these productivity advantage tend to go down. But one factor that, again, appears very important also for the returns to the use of artificial intelligence, for the productivity returns, is, again, that AI users do not seem to be all alike. And we see this in France, where we have more detailed information, which allow us to do additional analysis, distinguishing two different types of AI users. Those that use artificial intelligence but develop the technology in-house, within the firm, vis-à-vis those that actually buy the technology from external providers. And when we do so, we basically see that, again, on average, once we take into account these confounding factors, digital capabilities, human capital-related proxies, as well as past productivity, which is another way for which we could proxy these selection dynamics, the productivity returns on average completely go away, but for the developers, they actually remain positive and statistically significant, which actually suggests that these firms are those that may be already realizing the returns to artificial intelligence, because the link between AI use and productivity remains significant, even after controlling for all these confounding factors, and even when getting into more causal estimation strategies. So this was a little bit about firms. Then I just wanted to mention that the firm, of course, when you think about the links between AI use and productivity, there are different dimensions of analysis. And what the studies that I told were all about firm-level analysis. But beyond firms, we just a few months ago released a literature review that focuses on studies at the worker level. especially focusing on experimental evidence that looks at the effects of generative AI, so going beyond the predictive AI, on generative AI, on productivity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And what this literature says, so we reviewed more than 80 experiments on the topic, is that there are relevant gains from generative AI across the field, but the impact of generative AI appears to be highly dependent on how it is utilized, for which purpose, by whom, on their level of expertise and trust in the technology, suggesting that it is important to consider and understand the fit between the tasks undertaken and the capabilities of generative AI, highlighting once again that critical thinking remains key to enable workers and organizations to understand how to use generative AI, when to use it, and how to leverage its full potential. Then, getting to policy considerations, what can policymakers do in light of the empirical analysis that we have done? Definitely, they can continue and drive AI innovation and inclusive ecosystems. They can support firms' digitalization and an AI-enabling infrastructure by strengthening these digital capabilities that we have seen that are important in our empirical analysis. They should continue and develop human capital for AI adoption and use by developing not only technical but also non-technical skills and strengthening managerial capabilities, as well as continuing cooperating for trustworthy AI governance. One of the recent papers or the recent reports that we have released has focused critically on AI adoption by small and medium enterprises, and we have been working on this jointly with my colleagues in the CFE department and in the Employment, Labor and Social Affairs department, in the Center for Entrepreneurship, and in the ELS department of the OECD, and this has been informing the recent discussion, the recent G7 discussion on the proposed blueprint from SME AI adoption. And once again, critically, one key element of this report is the heterogeneity among different SMEs that use artificial intelligence. And what we have been doing, indeed, we have been introducing a taxonomy of SME AI adopters based on digital maturity, based on the complexity of AI use and the scope of AI applications, to illustrate that there are diverse paths of adoption and use of artificial intelligence, also through a number of use cases that my colleagues has put together in the report. And just to give you a preview of what the taxonomy looks like, so we have basically three key dimensions: the scope of AI application, the complexity of AI use, and digital maturities. And by using these different dimensions, one can recognize different adoption profiles. The SMEs that are more at the front everywhere, that are adopting AI enterprise-wide with frontier technologies. So we label these AI champions, with SMEs that are positions in different quadrants of the taxonomy. And this is particularly important for public policy because this can allow and tailor policy interventions for different categories of SME adopters. For instance, from the novice, it could be more relevant to build awareness and foundational capabilities, while for the AI champions, it would be more relevant to unlocking maybe scales through strategic infrastructure and ecosystem. So this concludes a little bit my presentation. Thank you very much again.
So thank you. Flavio has stormed us through the AI and adoption and product. And stay here, please stay with me, Flavio. And take your seat, because now we're going to I think there was an order, but you just come here. No, I don't. It's fine. It's fine. Here is good. There was an order, but I forgot it, and we're going to reorganize ourselves. So Flavio is going to discuss with us. I'm very happy to welcome Frederick Lange of the German Association of Industries, and he's been extensively working on an AI. And please take a seat. There's Alexander. Yes. Here. Alexander Schirsch of DIW here in Berlin is a productivity expert and is joining us as well. And so that we can have the... So you're basically... Okay. And that's good. And Tuin Gantrin is from A11, is basically coming to join us from as a practitioner and can tell us a lot about what's happening these days in the field of AI adoption. Hello. Yes. And before we start to discuss, to my digital audience, we are finally making good on a promise that we've made for 3 times. So I have an iPad here, and you can ask your questions, and I will see them, and of course the audience in the room as well. But perhaps we should discuss ourselves warm, so to speak, at the beginning. And Alexander, I think I want to start with you with a little bit of potential creative destruction. Because when I saw that, so when Flavio said, well, you know, the productivity effect is for many, it seems to be more about the managerial capacity or the digital enablers that are already there, at least for data before the latest that you were using. So before the latest generative AI boom, what I'm thinking is, well, at least that's the feeling, right? When you read the newspaper or you use AI yourself, you're thinking, oh my God, this is transforming everything. And what about the latest literature or your findings? Do you think that would still hold, or do you think it's completely different now, the impact that AI can have on productivity of firms?
Well, I think the latest evidence shows that there is some effect. I think I checked it when you made your presentation. The data was from 2019, I think. And I think that was one of the reasons why we didn't see it then. That also has to do with the adoption rates. At that time, the adoption rates were pretty low. Right now, what we see is that adoption is skyrocketing. So when you compare it to previous technologies, like let's say cloud, it took 20 years and we're still not there. Like less than 50% of German firms use cloud, which is a problem when we come to AI. But here, when it comes to AI itself, we have like 27% already within 1 year from 23 to 24. So it's really, and manufacturing, as you showed, is really one of the...
Europe or Germany?
27% in Germany. Europe is almost the same. You still have this pattern that you always have, like the Nordic countries are first. They are the ones to adopt it first. There's like, we're at 45% already there. Long story short, the latest numbers we have when it comes to productivity, we see some effects. And then I think, and Flavio made the point very well, there's a lot of heterogeneity. What is it used for? So there are case studies where you have it like in service sectors where you have like call center agents, essentially. They have a huge increase. And funny enough, it's the low, or not funny enough, but it's interesting enough because there's in the media a lot of talk like the high-skilled workers will lose their jobs and so on and so forth. There, what we see is that the low-skilled workers benefit the most. So the productivity effects are there for them mostly. So long story short, I think we will see a lot in the future.
On productivity. Well, good. Tuingan, is that how I should pronounce it? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
good. So you're basically surrounded not only by men, but also by, in some ways, by nerds, by economists who try to measure productivity and then look whether they can find statistical effect. But you're a little bit in the business of actually rolling it out, right? So we're very interested in what you have to say, but perhaps you can describe a little bit your business, which kind of firms you're helping, and what you're seeing there in terms of adoption. Who is adopting it? Is it really the digital champions that have just adopted all these other technologies before, who have the skills, who have the technologies? Or do you see AI adoption a bit more across the board now that it looks so transformative?
Yeah, let me maybe start with explaining what I actually do, and because that probably gives a bit of more context where my background is. So I've been working in the tech ecosystem for the last 15 years. I've been working with Zalando, Meta, and the last 10 plus years at Project A11. And Project A is a venture capital firm that invests roughly 1 billion assets under management into startups, but also PE investments. And hence my background is as basically A11 is the operations unit behind Project A that builds those unicorns, where we've basically scaled companies like True Republic, Sender, and so on. And last year we made the shift and decided that we also want to provide those services to other companies, so mainly the German Mittelstand, but also corporates. And the USP of our service is obviously because we come from the startup world, so we do things quite differently sometimes, I guess, or that's at least the hypothesis from the other side. And what I've seen is there is, first of all, I think there's a lot of, I don't want to say hatred, but there's a lot of misconception around the topic of AI, because we talk a lot about, as you said, AI is taking away workplaces, exactly, but also AI is, there's no ROI in terms of implementing it and so on, and it just continues to come in terms of those messages. And things that I've seen is that there's, if we talk about AI adoption, there are different phases of AI adoption. First of all, I think the easiest one is just using AI or any Gen AI tool, whether it's OpenAI, whether it's Claude, whether it's maybe even Grok. I hope not too many, but I don't think it's one of the best ones, to be honest. But that's the first phase, and there I agree with you that we have a lot of adoption because it's a product that is very easy to use. The user interfaces are, I mean, even my mom, who's 60 years old, no, she's 65. She's a digital native, and she doesn't even know how to paste things on her MacBook. But what she does know, she knows how to use the LLM. So that's the first phase. And then if we continue talking about AI, then it's also obviously about how to implement that into the companies in terms of their business processes. So is it incorporated in the production? Is it incorporated in the sales process? Is it incorporated in finance and so on? And there we do sometimes see that there are some ranges depending on what kind of people are sitting on those jobs. But I've never seen a company implementing AI and then getting rid of workforce. That simply has never been the case whenever I work with companies. What does happen is that it does increase the productivity of the people working in those teams, because you get things done much faster. You have more time to work on things that you usually wouldn't have time for, and so on. So it's a huge benefit, obviously. But I want to pause here because
we'll have further rounds, and it's a good start, and it's good to know that you work with a traditional Mittelstand, because then we can talk about how adoption works there. But I think I want to turn to Frederick and come back to Flavio's talk also a little bit, because what I heard a lot there, he was going really, really fast, but there were themes that came back, and one was, the ones that adopt, first they tend to have the human capital, the ICT engineers, etc. And also, they were already, if you're already quite advanced in adopting digital technologies, and Alexander just said it, cloud, so there's some lags here in Europe or Germany in particular, then you're more likely to adopt AI. So my question to you, representing German industry, does that worry you? Given that, in terms of digital adoption, the Nordics were further ahead, and certainly the United States, China is in many dimensions a different world. Is it, could it compound the effect of being left behind in terms of using digital technologies to become more productive?
Thanks for the question. I think you really hit the nail on the head, which is the reason why we have last October in BDI decided to write a paper and hold a conference on artificial intelligence. We also had some colleague from ECO at the OECD joining, Peter Gall, you will know him, and we discussed with him more or less a similar question, because we in Germany, of course, have been famous for missing past innovative waves. For instance, we haven't benefited from the ICT boom as much as the US, and in BDI we very much have the concern this might be very similar now in the field of AI. In Germany, we are, of course, a very manufacturing-heavy economy. We have the Mittelstand, so very many mid-sized companies. And when we look at various papers, including those from the OECD, including those from ECO, we do see that, and we have also seen it in your presentation, Flavio, today, that the benefits will likely be the highest initially in certain knowledge-intensive field, ICT, finance, administrative services. It will be less so in manual labor-exposed fields, construction, agriculture. And when it comes to manufacturing, it's somewhere in between. So from that, Germany would have a little bit of a middle starting ground, I'd say. But then on top, as I said, we have the Mittelstand. We've also seen it today. Generally, it's easier for larger companies to invest there in AI. They may have the talents, they may have the resources more to do so. And we are seeing that especially in established smaller companies, it is much harder for them to get going. It's a little bit different for startups and scale-ups, very innovative companies. There we see a different pattern. But in general, we found as a starting point, the German economy may not be so well positioned to benefit from AI. So we looked at various estimates, in particular the macro estimates. And indeed, when we all broke it down, we found a pattern which is to be expected, that most likely the US, the United Kingdom, will reap the biggest productivity and growth benefits. It seems when you look at the G7 that countries like Italy, Japan are at the lower end of the front, mostly because they have been a little bit later in adopting AI, and also because they are similar to Germany, a little bit more heavily leaning towards non-service sectors. And then Germany was found to be a little bit in the middle. And our estimate, to be concrete, we found that the German economy may, within the next 5 years, get a boost from artificial intelligence of around 0.3 percentage points in terms of growth, which doesn't sound terribly much, and it's, as I said, more or less in the middle of the G7 economies. But if you consider that Germany as a starting point has extremely low potential growth rates, which is in the range of around 0.4 to 0.5%, according to Council of Economic Experts, it is in fact a meaningful contribution in the end, despite it will probably not put us at the very forefront. And this is, I should note, assuming that we get the policies right.
Good. Flavio, I remember a couple of years ago, your group was coming forth with these hypotheses that you have, I forgot how there was a word for it, but basically that you have these productivity leaders who are racing ahead and then the rest that's falling behind. And if I look at what you presented us today, it sounds like that this is going to get worse, or I don't know. Can you see a pathway whereby AI could enable leapfrogging? And if so, what would be conditions for that?
Yeah, so it's a great question indeed, which links, I think, more broadly about to the debate on the link between AI and productivity at the macroeconomic level, and also reflecting on the previous intervention. I think one of the things that we may want to emphasize is, so there is this whole literature that talks about this J-curve hypothesis, which basically suggests that for a general purpose technology like artificial intelligence, it takes time to have productivity impacts materializing, because they need complementary investments in organizational capital, in capabilities, in reorganizing the firm production process, in making sure the technology is fit for purpose in the right path. And so this takes time to have this productivity benefits materializing. So it could be that we are at the earlier stage, and this may be why we don't see yet returns materializing. But to the extent to which these returns do materialize, and we already see it for developers, so for firms that may be more at the forefront with these investments, that may be leveraging already AI better or more directly have tailored the technology to their business process. These returns are actually materializing, and the extent to which, so indeed, as you rightly suggest, that there is a risk of widening gaps between the best and the rest of the firm population. And this is why it is important I think to have policies that focus on the diffusion of artificial intelligence. And in doing so, I think it's important to recognize the heterogeneity and the different starting points of different firms, their different complements, and their, which may require, as I was kind of suggesting, and as the G7 taxonomy highlight different policy instruments to make sure that they can, as you were mentioning, adopt the technology, but also leverage its full potential to realize its returns.
Thank you. So I'm through my panel once now, and yeah, I'm ready to take questions from the floor and still from the digital audience, which hasn't reacted yet. I can take one, and please present yourself. And
yes, I'm Georg Erber, former employee here at DIW, now retired. Oh, sorry. Once again, my name is Georg Erber. I was employed here for 35 years and I'm now retired and worked a lot on productivity. And I just want to make some remarks on the approach for dealing with AI. AI in principle is first just a buzzword because it's not well defined. We have a rapid evolution of AI. At the moment, we mostly talk of large language models, but now we have the development of AI agents. We have attempts to go to general intelligence. We integrate this AI into robotics, humanoid robotics, and therefore, I'm skeptical if you just ask someone, do you use AI? Will give you any meaningful information what's really going on. You have to break it down into a much more detailed structure to understand what's going on and what's matter in diffusion. That's the first thing. The second is usage of a software agent, ChatGPT, doesn't tell you anything about valuation. It's a big problem in the debate about AI. Companies invest hundreds of billions into AI projects, but there's no real return of investment visible. That's another problem. How to measure productivity in the classical approach if the output has no real market value. Yeah? This issue has to be discussed, but at the moment it's unsolved. Another problem related is, to my mind, that we have to distinguish AI is not separate. AI depends on training with data. And this has to be in real time, more or less, if it has to be up to date. And therefore, it's always a bundle. Data plus algorithms, AI algorithms, and those who own the data have a huge impact how good AI would be in the end. So you cannot talk about just AI because, for example, German companies own a lot of data and this has a huge value. And whatever algorithm you get from open source AI projects, it gives you no real return on investment. So I think we have to start from scratch, more or less, to understand the real process of value creation of artificial intelligence in a particular environment. Yeah? And without that, we don't learn much about it. That's what I want to point out.
Important points, and we're going to try and pick up on them in the debate. Well, for sure. Well, one point was, right, maybe I can, from the former DIW employee, I can go to the current one. Well, in terms of the definition of AI, it's of course a good point. But in general, what are also Flavio, right? When you want to break it down and you want to study the impact on productivity, what types of AI are you looking at? How do we measure it in economic measurement work, basically?
So I think I see the problem more with simple macro models, because in the micro world, there are very specific questions of what is used. So if you look at the Brynjolfsson paper, they have a specific AI tool that is applied to a certain group of people in the firm, and they measure how much faster they can achieve their goals.
Yeah.
And then essentially they can say, and they come up with a number of 15% in terms of productivity, because they can say, well, they save that amount of time, which means they can either do more, or in terms of like doing more of the tasks, or we don't need to hire more people to achieve more, so we can grow.
But these are specific professions, right? Customer services,
And then,
coding,
yes,
and
that was customer services. There are other. I mean, Flavio already said it at some point in the presentation. Right now, most of the surveys, and I'm also involved in one of these surveys, they are very, very detailed on what kind of technology, for what purpose, where is it used within the firm. So I think I agree in the very first period when when it was a buzzword, and when the ICT survey of Eurostat had the ability to ask, do you use AI or not? There I would agree. I think the recent surveys that I'm aware of are much more detailed, and we can like zoom into the firms.
It brings me perhaps again to the practical world, because I wanted to ask you about two things. One thing was, you mentioned it before, you do want to work with traditional firms. You mentioned that you worked with more like the startups before. So I wanted to know, how is that different in terms of perceptions? But then also we talked about the type of take-up. It's very different to if employees use an LLM in their phone under the table, which they probably do often, or if AI is really integrated into the core of some business, the core of the business, some administrative task or coding, whatever it is, where in some areas at least, I think we're pretty sure that you can achieve a lot of productivity gains. So how do these German Mittelstand firms, how do they go about it? And do you observe really, well, you don't measure it like in the economic measurement sense, but you see, of course, how the business is transformed. Perhaps you can share that a little bit.
Maybe just to comment first on the question of how was AI being measured and so on. First of all, I don't think that it really matters if we're talking about general intelligence or robotics and so on, because those technologies are not there yet. What we should really focus on is like what's on the market right now, what can we implement now, what are the tools that make sense to implement in 2026. I think that's the first point that I wanted to make. And then to your question of what's different, or maybe what's similar to between startups and also bigger German Mittelstand companies. So I think that's the misconception that probably, or most people would think that there's a very, very big gap between those two worlds. And I have to say, I've seen both worlds, and it's much closer to one another than one would think. Because one thing that really that's very similar to both of them is that they're both very entrepreneurial when it comes to how they lead their business, how they want to take risks to grow the companies. That's the first one. And secondly, I've worked with companies in the startup world that are actually quite bureaucratic, I'd say, where probably no one would have expected that, but that does happen. And then on the other hand, I'm working with Mittelstands companies that are the most entrepreneurial and just fresh minds in terms of how they go on about new technologies and so on. So first of all, that's probably my first comment, that I think those two worlds, those are not two separate worlds, but that's effectively one dominating factor that basically unites them both. And then to your question of what's the gap between using LLMs under your desk versus having that in the organization. First of all, I think we shouldn't punish that behavior, or I think that's something that would actually stop the adoption, because there has to be an intrinsic motivation of wanting to use the technology itself. Whether it's useful use cases or not, I think that's a different story. But first of all, that's something that we shouldn't punish too much. And to be honest, I think also a lot of bureaucratic or policies and so on, they're also kind of self-made by the companies. I do agree that the policies from the governments do not sometimes help, but it's still possible. So there are still companies that are able to work with that and implementing AI. And to the fact of like, does it actually have an impact on the P&L? It does have an impact. You might not be able to always measure that from like with apples to apples, and maybe it's apples to peers. But let me give you one example where it's a company that sells. It's an e-commerce company, basically. So as any other e-commerce company, that company is also hugely challenged by what is going on the geopolitical sphere right now, because the logistics sides, everything is basically blocked. The costs are going up in the P&L and so on. And the cool thing is that that company is still earning a plus in terms of the EBIT, so the earnings. It has it has a better margin than the previous years. And the reason is not because it has been looking at basically the logistics parts. Obviously, that's also one of the things that you have to look into. But it basically looked into how to implement AI in the different departments. And one of the biggest levers was actually implementing that in the product development. So basically coming up with new ideas of new products based on AI and their own data. So what it basically enabled them to do is that they were able to launch new products that are not third-party products, but their own brands, meaning that obviously the margin would go up, because own brands always have a better margin than if you would buy that from other suppliers. And hence the trend that it basically was able to achieve a higher margin, whereas the geopolitical situation is not easy at all. But just to give you an example of where the spectrums are, we're always trying to compare apples to apples, but a company is so complex in itself. And the one thing that we shouldn't do is just to focus always on the, I want to say bad things, but really to focus on the things that we can actually do right now and in order to implement that. And the things that I'm telling you right now, it's not rocket science. Literally every company could just do it. I think what it just needs is like you need to have the courage to do that, and also a certain will to go with the speed.
Thank you. And I'm told there's a question at the back. And
yeah, hello. So my name is Gedeon. I'm a postdoc here at DIW. So my question is regarding Flavio's presentation. If you could be more specific on what you have in mind when you talk about complementary aspects of AI adoption. And a related question is whether Germany's very strong manufacturing sector is whether a strong thing or a weakness in terms of AI adoption for the following years. Yeah, thank you.
Flavio.
Yes, so in the slide, in the paper, we look at empirically at complementarity in adoption, in the sense that we look at factors that are related to the use of artificial intelligence, and notably this in the literature refer to a complementarity test that is one of the different complementarity tests. So this is more complementarity in adoption than in the returns that has been put forward by Brian Johnson and Milgrom, which suggests basically that once you adopt these assets, you also adopt the technology. So basically, these factors related to human technological capital, so digital maturity of the firms, which we proxy with the use of other digital technologies, the human capital, the workforce, so we proxy this with the presence of ICT specialists, with the training of the non-ICT workforce, the digital infrastructure, so the access to a fast broadband infrastructure. So this is a little bit what we called in that sense. So these are enablers. You can think about enablers, or more broadly, digital capabilities of firms and workers, which in what we see appear to be not only positively related to adoption, so they can boost adoption, but appears to be, at least on average, to be some of the factors that seem to explain the productivity advantages of the adopters, on average, not as I said before, for the more advanced ones, we see that returns happen also on the top, also once controlling for all these factors, which seems to suggest that maybe these firms have already done the organizational complementary investments that may allow them to realize the productivity returns from AI. So maybe they position themselves a little bit further in the J curves. These are developers, these are firms that are more at the forefront, which perhaps links to another dimension of the role of AI for productivity, which is related to innovation. And as a GPT, AI has the potential, at least, to drive innovation, to change inventive methods, and this is one important channel looking forward through which I think AI can impact in the long run productivity growth.
There was a question about the German industry. Is it a pro or a con for AI?
So the question about the German industry, I guess, so what we really see is more at the firm level. So depending on the firms, what we kind of say is that if you have these capabilities and you are strong in that, then you may be in a good position to adopt the technology and perhaps to leverage the returns. So I'm not an expert of the German industry, but depending on the extent to which these complementary factors are already in place, that may be enablers, or there may be room for policy interventions.
Yeah. I think that it's a mix, certainly. Tommaso, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Tommaso Duso, head of the Firms and Market Department. My question is to the two practitioners, and it's related to the last words of Flavio. What can policymakers do from your perspective? So we talked about enablers, but we can also think of barriers to adoption. So policymakers are looking for suggestions. So Frederick, so do you have a clear suggestion? Or is you too?
May I divert that to you because you're from the BDI, so...
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a try. I'm not from our digital department who have all the nuances on policies, so I'm looking at it from more a macro perspective. But essentially, I think I can identify 4, which we also mentioned in our paper, which we see as critical. And one already came through a lot today, which is digital infrastructure as well, right? As a basic foundation. It's inevitable. And unfortunately, in Germany, as you all know, when it comes to things like high-speed broadband, for instance, which is, of course, very necessary to transfer data from A to B, we're not that advanced, fiber optics and so on. We're actually at the lower tier in the European Union. Then we have the challenge also with building cloud capacity, right? So also in German, high-speed Rechenzentrum. We're doing it, but I'm not sure if we're doing it faster than other leading economies. But I think there I'm a little bit more optimistic than on the broadband. So at BDI, we ask for more investment in exactly these, which is point number 1.
Can I just on this? So do you find it problematic that? Sorry. Do you find it problematic that this kind of investment is done by the hyperscalers? So, do firms feel these dependencies from, say, big tech as a problem? Do you think that the Deutsche Mittelstand would appreciate to have a German cloud, and that could help?
Yeah, interesting. This gets into different debate, which is broader than the just productivity domain. From a pure productivity question, we're happy to take as much investment as possible in some sense, right? At least in the first order. But, and this is something we're discussing actually this year much more in BDI, we always have a focus year. Last year it was a year of innovation, partly to do also for that reason we wrote the paper. This year and the start of the following year, we look at the resilience. And I think your question goes very much into the resilience domain. And from this, it's not very clear. I don't think, to be honest, at BDI we are positioned on that exact question yet. But I do see exactly your point. I do see a risk that we are getting increasingly dependent also in that domain on big tech, for instance, from the US, as we are already in cloud and in many other fields, in software. So surely there's a risk, and ideally there would also be European firms stepping in. that I can give you. Should I go maybe back to briefly to the other policy domains as well, next to the, because we got stuck at the digitalization, just very briefly. So skills would of course be one. We also discussed this today. So keep it short. It's also self-explanatory in some sense. Financing, I don't think we discussed too much today, right? So notably, we have this famous debate always in Germany about how to scale innovation. We're good in basic research, but we're not so good in scaling it. And I think it's the same debate which can also be applied to AI. So we really need to become better in certain venture capital financing to get it going. And the last point is regulation, also not so much my field of expertise, but I understand colleagues at BDI are very much concerned about the complexity of certain regulations. For instance, the AI Act is apparently quite complex, also not always self-explanatory how it works with other European regulation on cloud, on data, and this is also something we're very much looking into.
If I may add to that, so the reason why I also didn't want to comment on the policy part is because I'd like to think about like what can we actually do. I think that policy is not taking speed out. I do agree that the current regulations have some complexity, but the funny part is that there are service providers or there are websites that try to break that down, that complexity, and where you can ask a very simple question that basically tells you like, is it compliant, is it not compliant, and so on. So there are workarounds. I think nobody should take the regulations as an excuse to not go on with AI. And to your question, whether it's difficult or whether it should be a risk that hyperscalers are growing much further with AI wave that we're seeing right now. I think it is some sort of risk. But on the other hand, if you ask a company, do I go with AWS or do I go with, let's say, for example, Ionos or Schwarz Digits? Then that company will take whatever is the best provider for that. And right now, it is unfortunately AWS. So if you want to go into that field, then there also has to be some sort of, well, the performance has to improve on that end. So if you want to take that risk, then we should do that. But then we need to do that very diligently. And I think there was also a question around industry. What kind of role does it play for AI and so on? And I think the AI also for industrial companies has a huge potential, because an industrial company is not only industry or Maschinenbau, but also consists of finance, marketing, sales, and so on. So all those departments, they would also benefit hugely from that. And then more on a macro level, there is right now the trend going towards the so-called world models, where where some companies, for example, Army in France, are trying to get their head around how to build an LLM model, but based on physical data, where, for example, Germany would have a huge advantage because we have so much industrial data. That's still to be seen what's going to come out of that, but I think that would be a huge lever for the country itself. And we do see signals with Jeff Bezos, for example, just starting a firm that literally just buys industrial companies to get their data. I think that's already quite a signal.
Yeah, but please, I have follow-up questions, but Alexander wanted to make a point.
Just to give a number, we need 7 years to build a data center in Germany. And that's every other, maybe not every, but most other European countries are faster. When it comes to the regulation, the fact is that the Commission itself has realized that the regulation is way too complex. There are very overlapping regulations, the Data Governance Act, the Data Act, the AI Act, the e-privacy thing, and so on and so forth. And they actually tried to do something on that with the omnibus, the digital omnibus, but that, on the other hand, has created now the situation that the AI Act comes into force in 2026, so this year, August. And at the same time, the omnibus is tried to solve some of the issues, and it's not clear what will now be relevant for the firms who want to do something at the end of the year. And one other thing, maybe we need to find our niche, because developing models, you need a lot of computing capacities, and Europe is. I looked it up again this morning, 100 times less in terms of computing capacities in comparison to the US. So it's another world. And so which brings me back to what you just said. There are niches, and the industry field is such a niche, and that is why Bezos is currently traveling around the world and trying to find 100 billion to have his industrial AI project going. And the data is here already, so it's up to us to find, to just do it in a way and get some help from the Commission and the German government, of course, to have a setting that allows us to do it faster. And final word, the Commission and even the German government tries to go in that direction a lot. It's not that they don't see it.
Yeah. But I mean, it's an interesting point also about, Frederick, if I go back to the industry, German industry, and there's a lot of, basically there's a data wealth, right? But we've been discussing this for years, how can it be used? And if I think about, the cloud, do they really want to use cloud from hyperscalers? There were attempts to develop Gaia X, and for some reasons didn't work, although I think the hyperscalers were in that project. So, to become a little bit more constructive, I mean, there are also examples such as India, who's built this India stack, which basically is an infrastructure, a digital infrastructure that really defines what should be a public good. So data secure, data exchange, they have digital identities, and importantly, they have digital currencies. And there we've seen a lot of innovation and market entry, including in areas where you really have entrenched incumbents, which offer very attractive bundles. So Germany is building a Deutschland stack, but a Germany stack, but it's more basically to digitize government. But I'm just wondering, wouldn't there be a way, and shouldn't industry in Germany, in Europe, the Commission, think about what kind of infrastructure do we need in order to have trusted data flows, in order to get German, Italian, other industries to say, okay, now we can use our data and use AI in order to develop new products, in order to redevelop our business models. Is there no way to do this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I do think there is, of course, on the ground something happening. Lidl, Schwarzgruppe, and so on are doing their investments. Often we see also collaboration with US companies and German companies. For instance, with NVIDIA, there has been cooperations going on from companies. But I think it's an ecosystem, right? It's neither that the government can do it alone, nor that the industry can do it alone. So I think, it's a collaborative exercise. And what we're trying to get right is that the frameworks, that the foundation conditions are there to actually get these investments going, right? Because ultimately it needs to be a business case still. We heard today AI can be a little bit fuzzy to define, and we need to be clear on how we want to use it, and then also, basically what framework conditions we need to get there.
Tuingan, you were very, you're basically a practitioner. You said, well, let's think about what can be done with what we have at the moment. And one point, I wanted to take up one point from Flavio's presentation where he said, well, what we do see in the data, at least, is those companies who develop their own AI and basically adopt it for their own purposes in some ways, they seem to have, or at least even in the old days, they had more productivity gains. So how is that? Do you think, well, you said it's not rocket science. In some ways, everybody who's a bit entrepreneurial can do it. So do you think developing the skills to do this, adopting AI to what you have to take your business further, that's doable within the current framework, even in Germany? Or are there really some levers where you'd say, well, we need more skills in the workforce, we need more, I don't know, growth money for startups who can help these companies develop their solutions? Where do you see?
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of, let's call it growth money, to to boost that, because I think a company has, and especially the CEO of a company should be entrepreneurial, and being entrepreneurial means doing whatever it takes to make your company the best company out there. And I'm not a big fan of taking money from the government to achieve that, because that's something that should come intrinsically. Because I mean that's competition. That's how you.
No, I was more thinking about this idea that there's
I get
growth VC growth funding market is lacking.
Okay.
Basically, that there's not enough financing for startups. And we were talking more about the traditional companies, but it's also about, if what Flavio said was true, is true, that you need to adopt AI to your needs. Maybe you need also more companies who help you do that, who provide you with the technologies, etc.
Yeah.
And one, if we're talking about policies, one weakness that's always mentioned for Europe and other areas, other countries, regions in the OECD in terms of startup growth, is that you don't have the financing that you do have in the United States, or so is that a constraining factor? Do we need to think about how to develop our VC financial markets in general?
So first of all, I'll dissect the question into a few parts. First question was about buy or build, and for traditional companies, and I'm always pro buy, because it takes so much time to build an own infrastructure. I don't want to say it always makes sense, but things that you can just get off the shelf, then just do it. In some cases, if it's very IP related, then it can make sense. That's the first one. And then there are obviously a lot of AI companies and startups out there right now that have been founded in the last 3 years because of the wave that we're seeing, and they're definitely, especially tackling the challenges that more traditional companies have. And so that is already happening. We have 30% more companies that have been founded year over year from 2025, or I think 2024 to 2025. And then the question around VC money, if we need more, or is it difficult to build that? First of all, I don't think that all of the AI companies that are being funded right now will survive, because it's a very natural thing that with VC startups, 10% of the companies will make it. That's the first one. And then secondly, do we have enough money in the ecosystem? So obviously, it's not the same ecosystem that we have as in Silicon Valley, but there is still money. So it's still possible to go into fundraising here in Germany or also in Europe. And there are obviously also vehicles that we haven't activated yet. For example, if we talk about pension funds and so on. So those are things that would make sense. So there are some differences, but I also think that we're going to the right direction. And by no means is it is impossible to go into fundraising here. It's definitely possible.
Okay, there's hope. Good. I'm losing my hope that I'm going to get questions from my online audience, but no, I never lose hope. So, but please, we want to be interactive. Flavio, so Tommaso wanted to talk more about policies, and he's quite right. So I'm sure you are also developing with or without AI, probably with AI, your research program. And what I wanted to know, if you could, where do you suspect to be the policy levers, the productivity gain? So as the next step, if you could choose, or perhaps you are choosing, what would you want to research to understand? Where would you suspect that you see really what the mechanism is, which firms adopt, why? Could there be ways to push this a little bit? Where do you see the research agenda?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I think it points upon some of the issues we have been discussing so far, and one of which is to try and go deeper and going beyond just the concept of AI broadly, but try to unpack it as much as possible. So what we are trying in part of the research is to try and understand how a firm use artificial intelligence, notably by leveraging the survey data that are more recently available, looking at which type of technology firms are using, going beyond whether they develop it in-house or not, but also looking at which technologies precisely, where in the firm they are leveraging it, like in the marketing department, in the logistics department, in the R&D department, and so on, and relating all this not only to the enablers, but also with productivity, because with the new data, what we are trying and look now in the next wave of the project I've been describing is to see how much different use patterns and ways of using AI relate to different policy drivers, to different barriers, as well as to different returns from the use of artificial intelligence. And we hope that with that we can further improve our policy understanding. The second point is, again, try and map further this heterogeneity among the different types of adopters, because if as was rightly mentioned, as the G7 taxonomy that we propose, there are different pathways from adoption that are different policy instruments may be relevant for firms that have a very specialized need to AI use just in a business function, but is at the forefront, vis-a-vis a firm that is integrating AI everywhere, vis-a-vis a firm that is just starting to experiment with ChatGPT or something. And the third thing that's related maybe to a discussion more on the macro perspective, because if you think at the macroeconomic level, as I was mentioning before, one of the productivity growth drivers related to AI is the extent to which it improves innovation. Which type of innovation artificial intelligence is spawning, in which technologies, how much AI it is improving itself over time, how many loops it takes to get into relevant innovation. And so one of the things we are doing is to look at patent data to better understand these knowledge flows by looking at citations of patents, and this can help also understand one of the channels that maybe is a little bit more forward-looking, which is related to the extent to which AI can improve productivity through boosting innovation and changing the ways in which innovation takes place.
Mm-hmm. Alexander, you were mentioning, I think, Erik Brynjolfsson, and I see that some economists, certainly in the United States, are also getting really excited about AI and saying, well, there might be a growth explosion even, because what Flavio just mentioned, there may be this reinforcement effect that basically AI improves itself, improves the way it helps to do research, or does research itself, who knows. Can you see that happening? Is DIW redesigning its macro models to be prepared when it happens? And what would that look like?
I don't think that we design the models at the moment in that direction. And Flavio already said something that I would like to reiterate. There's this G curve, right? And that means essentially a lot of firms initially don't really see a benefit. That comes later, especially if they're a little bit older, if the structures are not as flexible, and so on and so forth. And so it would be a wild guess to say when it like kickstarts throughout the economy and everybody is like seeing 10, 15% improvements in productivity and EBIT or whatever. So I can't tell fortunes, so I also can't say when that is going to happen.
Frederick, you were now. Maybe I'm not being fair to you. Probably you talked about skills and as a policy lever. But I was just thinking when I think back to Flavio's two circles, and he said there were these. There were socio-emotional skills, right? That you need leadership and all of these things. And certainly, AI also transforms the way people learn these days. And I'm wondering, as German Industry Association, are you happy with how the German school and university system, preschool system, don't we have to have a much more focused discussion about how learning needs to transform in order for people to benefit from people and companies to benefit from these transformations?
Before I go into this, maybe just one question also on the macro domain. I think, yeah, I mean, the J-curve effect is very relevant. What I found interesting, I was recently in DC and New York and talked to some Fed officials, how they look at artificial intelligence. And what they told me is, yes, we are probably seeing some boost in terms of productivity, but this is unlikely to mean that we are seeing never seen before productivity rates, because AI might as well just replace the fading out effects of the previous ICT boom. And therefore, maybe we see levels of productivity just as before, which is good in a sense, because otherwise they would be going down, right? So it's always depending on the counterfactual. So just that just as a quick insight on that domain. And the second point I want to make is we talked very positively today on AI, but of course there's also functions of AI which can go in the other direction. I think Acemoglu talks about it in his paper, right? Deep fakes and so on. So functions which are not valuable for society. They might not always directly pop up in the growth numbers, but of course shouldn't be forgotten. Then on the question on skills, on education, here's the usual disclaimer. This is very deep BDA territory, not BDI. So we have this allocation of labor.
You can't talk.
Very much so. I speak under their control, so to speak.
Okay.
And what I can say on this is what actually made me a little bit worried is your findings on PISA. So I do think we need foundational skills, and these seem to be, if I understand your research right, weakening since 10, perhaps even 20 years across the OECD, also including Germany. So PISA results are not getting better, but are getting worse. And I do see, yes, artificial intelligence can help learning, but you may also make the argument it actually raises the hurdle rate for new entrants, because you need more critical thinking skills. You need many of the foundational automizable jobs, which maybe new entrants do in certain professions, can be automatized because they're repetitive. So I would almost see the case for you need different skills, which are partly different than they are taught at school, because often, at least in Germany, what I remember from my own learning, you learn by heart to a great extent. So I think we need certain different skills. But also, we should not underestimate that probably we need higher skills in the future, given that the hurdle rate may be increasing, in particular for entry jobs. And this is nothing to be underestimated. And I'm a little bit worried for that reason, looking at some of your research.
Perhaps related to that point, because you said, and I think rightly said, many people say that it shouldn't be punished that people are using their phone at work. I think what should be punished if firms don't find a way to allow their employees to experiment using AI and becoming more productive. Well, you said it's not rocket science. It's important to try for everybody, actually. And Frederick made a good point. I think also that even in learning, AI can go in two ways, right? It can help you learn, but it could also, because some things become so easy, you just stop learning them, and you could sort of have a breakdown of knowledge. There are even some. There's some research, societal knowledge. There's some research about that, but more to the point, in the practicalities of every day trying to develop AI that can be used in firms and make them more productive, do you see that is it the education system that's called for, or is it more also learning by doing and allowing that to happen in the business world?
Yeah. So with the tools that we have right now, it's really learning by doing. I think that there's obviously a lot of service providers in place that help companies to train their workforce, for example, with prompting and so on. And I think it does make sense to some extent, but the one thing that really needs to happen is that it has to start from the top. So if the CEO is not using AI, is not also pushing his or her team to work with those new technologies, then nothing will happen. So there has to be that shift. And some people might disagree with me here, but I do think that with the tools that we have right now, they have all very simple user interface. It's very easy to interact with, and to get back to the example of punishing or not punishing. So I work with one larger tourism provider, and they have a very, very strict compliance regulation system around AI and so on, tooling. The team essentially built their own automation with N8N. N8N is one of the German automation companies, especially with AI, including with LLMs. And all of that by themselves, they paid their own bills for that. And now they're not allowed to use that, which obviously doesn't make sense because it would make their life so much easier. And
the employees did that for themselves outside of the company?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's a great sign. It basically shows you that there's appetite for that. B, it's feasible.
Yeah.
C, you just have to find a way how to still allow that, because obviously, again, it would impact the productivity.
Yeah. Alexander had a point on that.
Yeah, just quickly, because it fits perfectly to something that I keep reading. Is the reason why we see that AI is adopted much faster than other technologies in the past is because the workers themselves privately have an access to it and use it and experience it. And actually, sometimes it's also the workers that say, we have to keep more critically thinking about what AI is telling us here, because I realized when I use it myself, sometimes it's just not saying the truth. And then also, because you just said it, a very large barrier to some surveys that I've read is if the owner, the managers are reluctant. I'm 60, I have never used something like that, I know how the market works. Then even if the workers are really open for it, nothing happens. And so this time I think this is different from, say, cloud computing or getting in broadband access or anything else. It's the workers who are at the same time pushing to some degree what we haven't seen before. And I think that makes a difference different to other technology adoptions that we have seen in the past.
I think that brings me to my last question for today, Flavio, and I think it's for you. Maybe I'll push it in the round a little bit. AI and aging or aged workforces. So is that something you want to look at, we should be looking at? So does it make a difference whether a firm has an older workforce or a younger workforce? Because sometimes there comes the age, right? But maybe I'm ageist now, I don't know, stop me if it need be, where sometimes people become more reluctant to using new technologies. Could it hinder? Or, depending on, because it all depends on what kind of AI we're developing too. You could also think about developing AI that makes it easier to use the skills you really have, experience, etc., and automate some things that get more difficult with age, just, I don't know, remembering things, or I don't know. Do we need to think about that dimension much more?
Yes, it's a very good question. I must say I don't work on this topic, but I'm pretty convinced that the latest OECD data about AI adoption at the individual level highlight considerable gaps between people that have different ages, as you were pointing out. So that's definitely a good point. I think more broadly, one of the things that we may want to reflect more broadly about is the how, not only using the technology, but how we do use the technology, both on the worker level and also on the firm level, as I was mentioning, because perhaps different ways of using the technology, of integrating it, of interacting with it might bring different outcomes in terms of learning on the worker side, in terms of growth and productivity on the firm side. And so more than if the how is maybe something that remains central and is also possibly important when you look at the heterogeneity into patterns of use by people that have different age.
Maybe a last question then for our practitioner. Is when you work with firms and they want to develop, adopt AI, use AI, transform their business models, do you see a difference in terms of if it's an older or younger workforce, or is that not the point? It's more about openness to using it?
To be honest, I don't see a difference because for example, also my grandma's using AI, which is sometimes a little bit weird. But so I don't see a difference when it comes to age. I also talk to company owners that are 80 plus years old, and they are so behind their toes to get their head around the new technologies. That's the first one. But when we talk about aging population and so on, then one reality is also that, especially industrial companies, that there is a skilled worker shortage. The skilled workers are going to, well, in Rente, and there is the gap, and it will, for some companies, it will be very difficult. And one of the things that we're working on right now is basically building agents or knowledge graphs that are based on the skilled workers that will not be there in the company at some point anymore. So that is something that where AI can also help with that, because it's not that as if a company based in Schwäbisch Hall can get skilled workers like that in their location. So there is some homework to do. So A, I don't see a difference, and B, I think AI can also help with that.
Mm-hmm. Frederick, what do you think? Rebuilding the workforce that's now retiring in AI form, and then we solve the skills shortage?
Yeah, there's a bit of a hope on this, right? Yeah. Especially in Germany, given we have such an aging society. It's more anecdotal evidence. I have it on it as well. I mean, I could imagine, for sure, younger workforce has more recently been in education and training, right? So maybe it's a little bit easier to use AI. On the other hand, yes, you can make the case AI can maybe solve this to some extent as well. So I'm not sure here. Then what I do think, mobility is an issue, right? Within firm and between firm mobility tends to be higher among it tends to be higher among younger people. So perhaps there are some more frictions in an aging society on this. And then enrollment in education and training or in reskilling, upskilling program is usually a bit higher in younger workforces than in older ones. So the case I would see there perhaps firms who have older cohorts of workers, maybe they have to invest a little bit more into education, training, and so on. But again, very anecdotal evidence on this.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I would say we can move to the informal part of our discussion. And of course, you're invited to continue and ask questions to the panel amongst yourself. And there's a little lunch prepared, and I thank DIW for that, my wonderful panel for the discussion. I think we haven't solved our problems. We don't know exactly how to shape our industrial strategies, but we have a better understanding of the issues now, I think.